Hello, you're listening to CFCR 90.5 FM. My name is Dean McNeil, and I'm a professor of music at the University of Saskatchewan. This is the first episode of a 6-part mini-series called Adversity Meets Resilience. It will be running June 1st through July 6th every Monday from 6:30 until 7 p.m. on CFCR radio. This series is about reflection of hard times that have helped shape our province and the people who reside in it. And at the same time, it's about resilience. It's about how, during tough times, people pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and keep moving forward with their lives. To me, music has always played a critical role in helping people through adversity, both on an individual and on a collective basis. Within this series, we'll be in conversation with historian Dr. Bill Wazer as we take a second look at some hard times in the province of Saskatchewan, and at the same time we'll be matching up this conversation with some music. We'll get to our first conversation with Bill in a moment. However, to start things off, let's listen to a song sung by one of Saskatchewan's premier singer-songwriters, Eileen Laverty. Here's Eileen singing Steve Early's My Old Friend, the Blues.
Just when every ray of hope was gone, I should have known that you would come along. I can't believe I ever doubted you. My old friend, the blues, another lonely night, a nameless town. If sleep won't take me first, you'll come around. I know I can always count on you. My old friend, the blues. Lovers leave and friends will let you down. You're the only sure thing that I've found. No matter what I do, I'll never lose. My old friend, the blues. Lovers leave and friends will let you down. You're the only sure thing that I've found. No matter what I do, I'll never lose. My old friend, the blues. Just let me hide my weary heart in you. My old friend, the blues.
That was Eileen Laverty singing Steve Early's My Old Friend, the Blues. We'd like to welcome now our guest speaker who will be featured throughout this 6-part mini-series, Dr. Bill Wazer. Bill probably doesn't need a lot of introduction in our community. You've probably read some things that he's written in the paper. He is a renowned scholar of history, recipient of the Order of Merit, a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and a member of the Order of Canada. A few years ago, his book, A World We Have Lost, Saskatchewan Before 1905, and won the Governor General's Literacy Award for Nonfiction. I I have worked with Bill in a number of capacities. We've done some projects together, some historic commemoration events, often around Remembrance Day. My other job is to run the Saskatoon Jazz Orchestra, and we've had Bill in as a speaker on many of our concerts to talk about various aspects of how history and music intersect. So with the global pandemic going on right now, I was talking to Bill, and it just seemed like an ideal platform, that is to say radio and community radio in particular, to have a discussion about what music and what history mean to us. So first of all, thank you, Bill, for making the time to have this discussion with us. And let's talk a little bit about history. You know, you've probably forgotten more about history than most of us will ever know. Why is history important? Why should we be studying it? Why is it critical that we maintain an accurate record and that we continue to kind of re-examine history as a living, breathing entity in our culture?
Well, first of all, thank you for the very kind words, Dean. It's a pleasure to be with you for this series, and I'm looking forward to it, a chance to have a conversation with you and share some ideas with our audience. Maybe the best place to start, Dean, is coming up with a definition of history, and I have a very simple definition of history. It's a definition I used to tell my students. I didn't want to make it complicated. I didn't want to make it too messy, but history is about change over time. Change over time. Now that may, as I said, sound very simple, but that's what we're dealing with. And we're dealing with change all the time. In fact, you would say over the last 2.5, 3 months, we've seen tremendous change. So for me, history is about change over time. I'm not a fact drubber. To me, history is not one damn fact after another. If it was, I wouldn't be in the business of being a historian. Yes, history is about change over time, but how we tell that history changes because of new interpretations. Mm-hmm. What happens is that we have new ways of looking at things. To give you an example, women's or gender history was not a popular field of study several generations ago, and so you will not find women or children or Indigenous people in the Canadian story. So we've got new ways of looking at things. And we're also turning to new sources. We're uncovering new sources that offer a different spotlight on it. I think the best example I like to give is a biography of John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister. And that's a 2-volume biography written by Donald Creighton, who was one of Canada's leading historians in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Anyway, in that biography, Donald Creighton rarely mentions Indigenous peoples, Indigenous policy. So why is that curious? Well, John A. Macdonald from 1878 to 1887 was Canada's Indian Affairs Minister. In other words, our Prime Minister wore 2 hats as Prime Minister and Indian Affairs Minister. And in fact, John A. Macdonald was Canada's longest serving Indian Affairs Minister. And yet, if you look at those early biographies of our first Prime Minister, nary a mention of Indigenous people. And then Blair Stonechild and I, my colleague at the First Nations University of Canada, came along and we dove into the Macdonald Papers for our book, Loyal Till Death, which looked at the 1885 Northwest Rebellion from an Indigenous point of view. And we found wonderful source material, and we were able to tell a different story based on sources that other people had ignored in the past.
You know, since we're kind of marrying together this idea of music and history, because we'll be playing a little bit of music from the various history topics that you're going to be speaking about through this series. I teach a jazz arranging class. When you're arranging or composing music, you're basically dealing with sound as people are experiencing it, often revisiting what people have done in the past, reimagining it, reinterpreting it, rethinking it, representing it. I often say to students, you know, people get tired of notes and rhythms, but they never get tired of story.
That's right.
And you're telling stories. So it's really fascinating that we're starting this series with you using a phrase. I literally use the phrase changes, as in chord changes, over time in this class. I have a great and deep appreciation for history. I don't feel like I know enough about history, to be honest. But I had some early experiences. Literally the very first gig I ever played as a trumpet player was in elementary school. and I played The Last Post for the school over the loudspeaker. At the time, we had a World War I vet living in our house. He was a friend of the family that had nowhere to live, and so my parents, who often took in strays, to put it mildly, had this old guy living with us. And I remember talking to him. His name was Uncle Mac, a living representative of the First World War. He had been shot in the shoulder and was immobilized in one of his arms. So I'm always thankful to have an opportunity to have these types of conversations and to participate in some kind of way as a musician in commemorative ceremonies that continue to bring the story of history to life.
I think it's quite perceptive what you're saying, because I'm a great believer in stories too. Stories, we tell stories when we're together with our children or with our broader families. We tell stories when we're visiting with a friend. Stories provide people with connections. Stories allow us to reach back over time and space. And so when you talked about the Great War veteran, and he might have a particular story, it allows you to make that connection. Mm-hmm. And stories really provide us with a sense of the past. They provide us with a sense of place. They provide us with a sense of identity, who you are as a person and where you fit in. Stories, I find, and to me, history is about stories. It provides us some much needed perspective, of days gone by. And as you know from your own experience, stories can be empowering or stories can be painful, but they're a way of making connections. And I often like to write history by using a story within a story. And I'll give you one example. For my Centennial History of Saskatchewan, which I published in 2005 to coincide with the provincial centennial, I opened the chapter on the Great Depression with a famous photograph. It's a farm family stranded in Edmonton. Their car is broken down. There's the mother and father. The mother's holding a newborn, and there's children scattered along the front of the vehicle, none of them with shoes. And that's the Fair family. And I told their story, that individual story, as a springboard into the larger story of the Depression. So you make that connection with the reader. You reel them in, and then you can bring out the bigger themes or the bigger stories, the stats, et cetera, but you're trying to make that connection.
I couldn't agree more, and a small story or your picture of that family helps tell the larger narrative, which I think is so interesting. It creates a through line, right?
That's right. And I want to make sure your listeners understand, I'm not saying you dumb it down, and that's an insult to the listener. Yeah. What I'm saying is you make that connection. I used to work in TV and radio 15, 20 years ago, and I had a very tough producer, tougher than you, okay? And he used to say to me when I took to him a story idea, why should I care? Make me care. He wasn't saying exaggerate it, but he says, make that connection, make me care. And it's something that has shaped and informed my writing ever since.
Well, it's so interesting that you're talking about radio too, because some people feel like this is the golden age of radio. This is, just so the listeners know, this is my very first attempt at anything like this. I've never done interviews, and I'm a little bit out of my element here, as I'm sure will be apparent at some point during this 6-piece miniseries. But I just love the idea of radio in particular. We've got all these forms of communication in this modern digital age. The very first broadcast of radio happened in 1895, I believe. It was in Italy, and it was between two rooms by Marconi. By 1899, they sent the first broadcast across the English Channel, and in 1901, they sent the first broadcast of radio from England to Newfoundland. And this idea of people being sequestered in their house, people listening to radio again, I just think there's something so intimate and historical, even about the medium itself, that it just seemed really cool to produce some kind of series where we're talking on radio about hardship in Saskatchewan. Because one of the things that I've learned from talking to you, Bill, and reading some of your books is that we're not that special right now. It's not as if this is the first time something like this has happened, and indeed, the Saskatchewans have been through much, much worse in the past. So, I think this is going to be a really terrific opportunity for people of Saskatchewan to hear some extraordinarily accurate and compelling stories from you, a leading historian, to just kind of help us remember that we've been through things like this before, and there's light at the end of the tunnel on the other side.
That's true. I'm just going to say one thing about radio before I get into another comment, but radio may not shrink distance on the map, but it does shrink distance in the mind. And that's one way of looking at it, and allows us to make connections with one another. But to get back what you're saying about this series, history to me also has great explanatory powers, Dean, and history allows us to gain perspective on today through an understanding of the past. In other words, I believe that people today need to be well armed to engage in some of the debates we're having now about what we face or what we're going to face in the future when we eventually climb out of these damaged times. And history can provide us some perspective. You know, to have an informed debate, you need an understanding of what happened and why. And that's what history can do, provide that understanding. You know, what did happen and why did it happen? We're already starting to do the postmortem right now on what could we have done better at the beginning of this pandemic. And so having that knowledge will help us to be better informed and also help us have a better debate as we go forward. And history does that.
Yeah, the importance of preserving our collective memory, I just find it so fascinating. I watched a BBC special a while ago on how memory works in the brain. Basically what brain researchers were saying is that every time you re-experience a memory, we used to think it was like taking a book off the shelf and reading the book, and that couldn't be less accurate. Different parts of a memory are stored in different parts of the brain. When you re-experience it and you retell it or rethink it, there's a high degree of probability that memory will be changed. So we move from something that could have been true to should have been true to was true. And they have all these experiments where they interviewed people and they actually planted memories in their brain through the interview process, and through a series of interviews they were able to convince people that things happened in completely different ways than they actually happened.
That's what I do in my new book. I've just got a new book out, Dean, called In Search of Almighty Voice. It looks at the Willow Cree man who was one of the most wanted fugitives in Canada in the 1890s. Well, the first half of the book, I try and explain what exactly happened to Almighty Voice and how he met his death at the hands of the Mounties in 1897. But the second half of the book looks at how that story has been told over the past 120 years. There have been 300 articles. There's been one bad movie. There have been 2 plays. And I slice and dice, let's put it that way, all of these stories about Almighty Voice. And it's amazing how contorted, how twisted, and and quite frankly, some of it's is bullshit. And if I could be blunt, and I do tell that story, and what happens, we've got so far away from what did happen, and that's where I try and bring the reader back to, and that we need to remember what did happen, because there can be no reconciliation without an accurate memory.
One of my favorite podcasts is Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History. He makes 2 points. One is that when history is told for the first time, we almost always get it wrong. And 2, history is always written by the winner.
Yeah.
Right? In music, we often refer to, when we're looking back historically on certain pieces of music or whatever, we often use the term the cream of the crop. So it's very hard to tell in 2020 what the most important music is in 2020. It's when we can look back after a few years to see who was listening to that music, who was building upon that from a sense of artistry, what effects of pop culture we're having on, like, what was the really, true influence of a piece of music on a society. It's very difficult to do that while it's happening, and it's very difficult to do that right afterwards, and we often get it wrong, and we have to go back.
You've underlined the importance of archives. We don't know today, Dean, what's going to be historically important tomorrow. And so that's why we need that record preserved. And to give you an example, let's say we're looking at residential school students, and let's say the federal government decided not to keep those records. Where would we be on the issue of reconciliation? Or another example are homestead records. We have a wonderful collection of homestead records, the people that first came here to settle the land, white settlers I'm talking about. Those records have been preserved, and they're often used today by families to do their family history. But it's very fortunate that those records were kept because, as I said, we don't know down the road what's going to be historically important.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to do is politicize a conversation like this, but when you're talking this way, people will often be focused on, well, we need the potholes fixed, and you know what I mean? Like, we need these rubber to the road, or we need our money to go to the here and now. But we need historians, I think, in times like this, as much as we need musicians and artists, as much as we need people working at VITO, the viral infectious disease. Like we need all of these things. So I just think it's really important that we have these discussions. And again, I just look forward to this series, Bill, in which you're going to walk us through some times in which we've had hardship in our community, and hopefully I can attach to the narrative you're spinning some music that was relevant to the people of the day and help bring that culture back to life.
Thank you, Dean, and I'll make you a promise. I will not sing or attempt to play an instrument, okay?
Sounds great. Since this introductory episode is not tied to any particular historic event, and since we're talking about resilience through this series, I want to play for you next a song composed by a very special Canadian composer and jazz pianist, Amanda Tossoff. Amanda last visited Saskatchewan a few years ago as an instructor at the Saskatoon, Saskatchewan Jazz Festival's Jazz Intensive Music Camp. Amanda used as the basis for this song a poem by the great English poet William Wordsworth. Wordsworth was the poet laureate for Queen Victoria and is known as one of the founders of the Romantic poetry era. Both the song and the poem are entitled Daffodils. Now, daffodils are an amazing, resilient plant. They can survive frost, the roots can survive our robust Saskatchewan winters, and in the spring, they literally bloom through the snow-covered ground. Make this a moment of mindfulness for you. Sit back and enjoy Amanda Tossoff's Daffodils.
That floats on high over vales and hills. When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them dance, but did the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be there in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For often when on my couch I lie in vacant flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils.
So thank you everyone for tuning in to this first of a 6-part mini-series. These are conversations with Saskatchewan historian Dr. Bill Wazer. Next week, Bill is going to talk to us about how a medical doctor for the Hudson's Bay Company made an amazing contribution in Western Canada during the 1837 smallpox epidemic. My name is Dean McNeil. This is Adversity Meets Resilience on CFCR 90.5 FM. Thanks for spending time with us, and we'll hope you'll tune in for episode 2 next week.
They flash upon that